116 pounds, 12 ounces, 1 can of Spam, $1.50. That is not a joke. That is an IGFA certified line class world record. And the fishing industry has been trying to bury this story for over 2 decades. Welcome to Forbidden Lures. Today I am building a case against every overpriced synthetic dip, every $30 designer crankbait, and every slick marketing campaign that ever told you success lives behind a price tag. The evidence? A slab of processed pork that outperformed every premium bait on the market and dragged a prehistoric river monster onto a certified scale. By the end of this video, you will know exactly why this cheap canned meat triggers a biological feeding response that fish physically cannot override, how to modify it into an indestructible superbait, and how to rig it like the European pros whose techniques American tackle companies have kept out of your hands for decades. Let's open the case. Part 1. The day a $1.50 can embarrassed a billion-dollar industry. August 3, 2001. The Mississippi River, just downstream from the Interstate 55 bridge near Marion, Arkansas. Picture this: a wing dike, deep, violent currents slamming against submerged structure. The kind of water where trophy blue cats stack up like cordwood, and where every serious cat fisherman on the continent will tell you there is only one acceptable bait: fresh-cut skipjack herring or premium gizzard shad. But on that morning, an angler anchored up with 2 buddies wasn't playing by those rules. His setup? A medium-weight spinning combo, 20-pound test line, nothing fancy. And on his hook, a chunk of Hormel Spam straight out of the can. 30 minutes of dead silence. Then the rod buckled. Not a tap, not a nibble. The rod folded in half like someone tied it to a freight train. Line screaming off the spool. Drag maxed out. The fish stripped line with a raw, mechanical violence that pushed that 20-pound mono to the ragged edge of its breaking point. For 45 minutes, in heavy Mississippi current, it was a war of attrition between a man with modest tackle and something ancient lurking on the bottom. When the beast finally rolled at the surface, everyone on that boat went silent. They got it to a certified scale. 116 pounds, 12 ounces. The existing Arkansas state record obliterated. The International Game Fish Association certified it as a 16-pound line class world record for blue catfish. Think about what just happened. Not a $100 bait rig, not a tournament setup with braided line and custom rods. A can of processed meat from the grocery store just produced a world record specimen. And the tackle industry? They never talked about it. Because you can't build a product line around a secret that costs $1.50. But the question that should be eating at you right now is this: why? Why did a 30-year-old apex predator, a fish that had spent its entire life hunting live prey in pitch-black water, choose to eat processed pork? The answer is pure biology, and the industry doesn't want you to understand it. Part 2. The biological hack. Why catfish are hardwired to eat this stuff. Let me reframe what a catfish actually is. Forget everything you think you know. A catfish is not just a fish. It is a chemical weapons detection system wrapped in skin. Biologists call them swimming tongues, and that is not a figure of speech. While you and I taste food with a few thousand taste buds inside our mouths, a catfish is covered head to tail in chemoreceptors. Imagine if every square inch of your skin could taste whatever it touched. That is a catfish. Now let's talk numbers, because this is where it gets insane. A largemouth bass has roughly 10 sensory folds in its nasal cavity. A trout has about 18. A channel catfish, or a blue cat? Over 140 sensory pads dedicated to smell alone. To put that detection power in terms you can feel, a catfish can identify a single amino acid dissolved in water at parts per billion concentration. That is the equivalent of 1 drop of scent in an Olympic-sized swimming pool. In total darkness, in heavy current. They do not need to see your bait. They do not need to hear it. They track it through an invisible chemical highway that you and I cannot even perceive. So what exactly are they tracking? 3 categories of molecules that light up their brain like a switchboard. First, amino acids, specifically compounds like alanine, which flips on the investigative foraging response. The fish stops cruising and starts actively searching. Second, lysine. This one is so effective that commercial aquaculture operations use it in feed pellets to trigger aggressive consumption. Third, and this is the heavy hitter, taurine. Research shows taurine can cut a catfish's reaction time in half and increase its swimming velocity toward the scent source by over 160%. It is not an attractant. It is a command signal. The fish does not decide to investigate. It is compelled. Now here is the forbidden part. Look at what is inside a can of Spam. Pork, ham,
Salt, water, potato starch, sugar, sodium nitrite. It is a dense matrix of animal fats and proteins, the exact raw materials that break down into those 3 categories of trigger molecules. But the real weapon hiding in that can? Sodium. Spam has an astronomically high salt content. When you drop a cube into the water, that salt creates a powerful osmotic gradient. Think of it as a chemical pump. It forces the water-soluble proteins, amino acids, and fats out of the meat and aggressively into the surrounding water. Not slowly, not passively, aggressively. The scent radius Spam produces disperses faster and wider than most natural, unprocessed baits. When that chemical cloud hits 140 sensory pads on a 60-pound blue cat, the fish's olfactory bulb registers a massive, concentrated food source. The brain fires, the dinner bell rings, and the fish commits. You are not offering bait. You are hacking a nervous system that took millions of years to evolve, and you are doing it with a $1.50 can of meat. But here is the thing. Even the best scent in the world is useless if your bait cannot survive the cast. And that brings us to the dirty little secret about the most popular catfish bait in America. Part 3. Spam versus chicken liver. The bait the industry won't compare. I already know what some of you are thinking. Hold on. My granddaddy caught 100 cats on chicken liver and his granddaddy before him. Fair enough. I am not here to disrespect chicken liver. It is packed with blood, enzymes, and amino acids that catfish absolutely crave. That is not the debate. The debate is whether it actually stays on your hook long enough to matter. Let's be brutally honest. Fishing with chicken liver is a logistical disaster. It is soft, it is slimy, it is saturated with fluid. You rear back for a long cast and it rockets off the hook before your line even hits the water. Even when you do manage to get it out there, current or nibbling baitfish shred it within minutes. Anglers have literally resorted to wrapping it in sewing thread, stuffing it in gauze bandages, even cramming it into old pantyhose, just to keep it from disintegrating on contact. If your bait is sitting on the river bottom somewhere behind you, while your hook drifts naked through the strike zone, it does not matter how good it smells. You are fishing with nothing. Spam solves every single one of those problems. Hormel adds potato starch to the formulation. That starch acts as a structural binder.
It gives the meat a firm, rubbery consistency that grips a hook and holds through hard casts, heavy current, and aggressive pecking from nuisance fish. And this brings up something most anglers never think about. How much of your session are you actually fishing? I mean, really fishing. Bait in the water, in the strike zone, doing its job. With chicken liver in moving water, you might spend a quarter of your time reeling in, discovering a bare hook, wiping blood off your hands, rebaiting, and casting again. That is dead time. Every second your hook is out of the water is a second you cannot catch a world record fish. With Spam, your bait stays put. You are in the strike zone for the vast majority of your session. Cleaner, faster, with zero prep time on the bank. It has a shelf life measured in years. You do not need a cooler. You do not need bait shops. You walk into any gas station in America, spend $1.50, and you are armed. But what if I told you that straight from the can Spam is just the starting point? What if there were underground modifications that turn it from deadly into something the fish literally cannot refuse?
Part 4. Forbidden Enhancements. Weaponizing your meat. Spam out of the can is already a killer. But on this channel, we do not settle for good. We chase lethal. And because Spam is porous and loaded with water and oil, it is the perfect carrier sponge for layering additional scent and modifying its physical properties. Here are 3 field-tested modifications that serious anglers use, and that you will never see advertised in a tackle catalog. Modification 1. Sun Cure. Your bait just became armor-plated. When you arrive at the water, cut your Spam into 1-inch cubes and spread them on a flat surface in direct sunlight for 2 to 3 hours. The sun bakes a tough, leathery skin on the exterior. Turtles and trash fish that would normally strip a soft bait in seconds cannot get through that crust. Meanwhile, the interior stays perfectly moist and oily, continuously leaking scent into the water column like a slow-release capsule. Hard outside, juicy inside. Tough enough to survive the hit, soft enough to keep broadcasting. Modification 2. The Pan Sear. This one you prep at home. Throw your cubes into a hot skillet and fry them lightly on all sides. 2 things happen. First, the sugars and starches caramelize into a hard crust that locks onto the hook. Second, the heat renders the pork fat. When you cast that seared cube into cold river water, those rendered oils are highly mobile. They explode outward, creating a visible oil slick on the surface and a massive scent plume underwater. And here is a bonus most people do not expect. Frying makes the Spam slightly buoyant. Your bait hovers just above the mud and silt instead of disappearing into it. It becomes a pop-up bait, visible, elevated, and impossible for a cruising catfish to miss. Modification 3. The Garlic Kool-Aid Soak. This one sounds insane. It works. Take your Spam cubes and soak them overnight in a bath of cherry or strawberry Kool-Aid powder mixed with heavy garlic powder. Here is why. The Kool-Aid delivers a concentrated sugar hit, a fast-burning carbohydrate signal that shocks the fish's chemoreceptors like a flashbang. The garlic delivers sulfur-based aromatic compounds, a slow, heavy scent trail that fish can track from hundreds of yards downstream in stained water. Together, you get a 1-2 punch. The sugar screams, "Food here, now!" And the garlic lays a long-distance highway leading straight to your hook. And there is an additional tactical benefit. Garlic completely neutralizes the L-serine amino acids that transfer from your hands to the bait. L-serine is a human scent marker that puts cautious fish on high alert. The garlic masks it entirely. You are not just flavoring your bait, you are engineering a multi-layered chemical delivery system. And the best part?
Total cost for all 3 modifications? $0 additional dollars. But none of this matters if your bait rips off during the cast, and that is where a rigging technique the American market has completely ignored comes into play. Part 5. European rigging secrets the U.S. tackle industry buried. Here is something that should make you angry. Across the Atlantic, British and European specimen anglers have been using canned luncheon meat as a primary big fish bait for over 40 years. They have refined the rigging, the presentation, and the delivery to an art form. They catch massive carp, barbel, and chub in waters so heavily pressured that fish have learned to reject any bait that feels even slightly wrong. This knowledge exists. It has been proven for decades, and the American tackle industry has zero incentive to bring it to you because it does not sell product. Here is what the Europeans know that you do not. If you are mashing a cube of Spam directly onto a standard J-hook, you are making a critical mistake. Big, cautious fish, whether they are carp or trophy catfish, have one universal behavior. They test the bait.
If they feel the resistance of a hook buried inside soft meat, they blow it out instantly. You never even know they were there. The solution is the hair rig. Instead of impaling the bait on the hook, you thread the Spam onto a short piece of line, called the hair, that dangles below a bare, exposed hook. The fish sucks in the soft meat freely, with zero resistance. No metal, no alarm bells. When it tries to swim away or eject the bait, the bare hook catches perfectly in the corner of its mouth. Hookup rate goes through the roof. But there is a problem. When you launch a heavy sinker setup on a long cast, the force of the cast can cause the thin, hair-rigged line to slice clean through the soft Spam like a cheese wire. Your bait is gone before it hits the water. The fix is dead simple, and it is the best rigging tip you will hear all year. The drinking straw hack. Take a small plastic drinking straw and push a short section of it straight through the center of your Spam cube. Then run your baiting needle and hair rig line through the hollow center of the straw. Lock it with a pellet bait stop. Now the cast pressure is absorbed entirely by the rigid plastic straw, not the soft meat. Your bait survives rocket launches. You can cast as hard as you want, as far as you need, and that cube is not going anywhere. One more technique for smaller water: free lining. Tie a hook to your line with absolutely zero weight. No sinker, no bobber, nothing. Hook a generous chunk of Spam and cast it upstream. Open your bail and let the current carry the meat downstream naturally, tumbling along the bottom. It mimics a piece of dead forage that has been dislodged by the current, the most natural presentation possible. When a predator intercepts that drifting chunk and simultaneously hits the wall of rendered oil trailing behind it, the strike is not a tap. It is a detonation. These are techniques that European match anglers and specimen hunters have pressure tested for 4 decades. Proven, refined, documented, and you have never heard of them because there is no product to sell. Conclusion. The verdict. Let's close this case. A 116-pound IGFA-certified world record blue catfish fell to a $1.50 can of processed meat. Over 140 chemosensory pads on a catfish's body are biologically hardwired to hunt down the exact amino acids, sodium ions, and animal fats locked inside a can of Spam. Sun curing, pan searing, and garlic soaking transform that meat from effective to indestructible. And European rigging techniques that the American market has ignored for decades ensure your bait survives the cast, the current, and the bite. The tackle industry has a vested interest in keeping you confused, overwhelmed, and reaching for your wallet.
They profit from complexity. They profit from your doubt. But the evidence does not lie. The most devastating weapon in catfishing history has been sitting on a grocery store shelf this entire time, unsponsored, unadvertised, and unforgotten by the anglers who actually know. Next time you head to the river, skip the tackle shop. Walk into any convenience store, grab a can of Spam, and put the science on trial. If this case convinced you, do one thing for me. Subscribe to Forbidden Lures, because the industry is not going to expose itself, and we have a lot more buried evidence to dig up. Hit the bell so you are in the courtroom for every new episode, and drop a comment below. Have you ever caught a trophy on grocery store bait? I want to hear what the industry does not want people sharing. Keep your lines tight, your mind open, and never stop hunting the truth. I will see you on the water.